accepted it a bit, moved to the side, said they were against it, pushed away an egregious bit, accepted a bit, then another generation would accept a bit more. Then another generation would accept a bit more. The average Tory in the 1960s would have regarded race as a fact of social existence. Now you'll be expelled from the modern Tory party for saying that. That's 40 years. It's nothing. Half an adult lifetime. And that's because of what's up here, particularly amongst relatively sort of unintelligent people up to a point, although there are many intelligent people in the Tory party. But it is because of the Second World War and its aftermath and the fear, the self-loathing and self-hatred in many relatively normal, quote-unquote, conservative people who are the mainstream in any society. In any society, you have to have a mass of people who are a bit stuck, a bit boring, a bit uncreative, because they are the bedrock. They're not going to be exceptional, but you can't have that in any social order. One of the delusions of Marxism is that everything could be different. Trotsky wrote an extraordinary essay in the early 1920s when the Soviet regime had just been created and was caked in blood. He wrote this essay saying, when we've achieved pure socialism, there'll be a Wagner, yes, a Wagner. There'll be a Shakespeare. There'll be a Byron on every corner. Everyone can be liberated to be free and creative. But now the struggle, and we're stood in our little Bolshevik hat caps on pyramids of skulls, which is what they were. Lenin was an extraordinary man in some ways, because in the 1921 Congress, he had a secret speech to the Congress, which wasn't revealed until the Soviet Union came down. The interesting thing about communists is because they believe they are the wave of the future, they write down everything they do. And they write down all their massacres as well. The massacre of the Polish officer corps in the Katyn forest, for example, which was ordered by the Politburo, and they all signed it. Stalin signed it. Khrushchev was next, yes, I'm signing. And they all signed it. And this was revealed after the breakdown. Because they believed that they were the wave of the future. And an atrocity, you see, an atrocity is important. It's not something you should be ashamed of. Because you are aiming for the betterment and progress of the whole of humanity. You have to be proud to wade in the blood of reaction in order to achieve the future, which is socialism. They called it the yawning heights. The yawning heights of socialism. There's a very satirical, negative, anti-Soviet novel called The Yawning Heights, written by a working class university professor of philosophy called Zinoviev, who hated the system by the time of its end, because everything creates its reverse, you see. But communism has affected and mutilated the world to an extraordinary degree, which most people in the West who believe they were on the winning side in the Cold War haven't even really begun to understand. Communism has also, in a Marxist sense, affected their own societies extraordinarily, radically, whilst appearing to have completely lost in the terms of fringe leftist sects and groups. Adorno wrote in Minima Moralia that after Auschwitz there can be no poetry. He believed that after this seminal event there could be nothing but sackcloth and ashes forever. And somebody once said to him, well, that's a pessimistic position, which is ultimately conservative. Conservatives don't believe life can be perfect because man isn't, and therefore utopianism is an impossibility. Leftists say, oh, well, you reject all forms of progress. And the two sort of square up to each other in political terms. Don't forget I'm talking about the philosophies, not the sordid little compromises of parties in the Western world are virtually indistinguishable from each other. Now, Marxism believed, almost with post-religious ardour, as it shot religious people, that everything could be changed, everything could be reworked, that man himself could be reworked. One of their most fanatical postulates is hostility to all biological notions of man and all notions of prior inequality. The idea that in the end even human rights jargon will always disappoint, because there are always beautiful people and ugly people. There's always unintelligent people, there's many of them, and there's always very intelligent people and always a range with it between. There's always people of great physical power and people who are weaklings. A very left-wing socialist friend of mine from years ago said, the trouble with you, he's speaking to me, is you're against human fairness. You're against being fair. And I said, go to a maternity ward. Go to a maternity ward and one's born without an arm or without an eye. Others are born hale and hearty. Some are intelligent and will never have a moment's disease in their lives. Others are crippled from the very beginning, and he talked to me about fairness. And he said, maybe it's not like it should be, but we must strive to make it so. And I say, well, why don't you just accept the plenitude of that which is created? He said, no, that's too passive. We must work on it to change it, to make it better. Now, most people in their hearts in this society believe that making things more equal makes them better. I don't. I believe making them more unequal makes them better, which means you're monstrous in contemporary terms. But I believe, because the greater the space between people, the greater the prospect of transcendence. And the greater the prospect of overleaping the present means you can actually not evolve physically, but mentally and spiritually into something else. If there's nothing above you, there's nothing to aspire to. There's just endless stuff beneath you. But I'm an elitist. No contemporary, even right-wing conservative politician will admit that their party actually stands for inequality. Even in capitalism, which has endless inequalities of outcome, doesn't it? That's why you have two big classes. Of course you believe in inequality, but the Majors and the Camerons and the Haids of this world, the Duncan Smiths of this other world, they talk about liberty. And they talk about freedom. And they talk about choice to schools, choice of race, choice of gender, choice where where you go to buy stuff, and so on. Choice. But if you choose one option, you deny another. If you radically choose one thing, you just privilege another therein. All life, even at the moment of small decisions, teems with the bias towards inequality. Discrimination. I believe in discrimination. Discrimination is a moral good and a moral law. It's an aristocratic spirituality. Of course you discriminate. You discriminate over who's your enemy and who's your friend. You don't treat people all as the same, except in some universal nimidom, which only exists in the minds of people who'd like human nature to be different from what it is. People become more right-wing as they get older, on the whole. Yeah. Even within leftist systems, people actually do get more metaphysically conservative as they get older. Why is that? Because death approaches, reality approaches. Yeah. They can't live with these deluded, nonsensical views about human life, which is based on inequality and glory and difference. History's been made by a small group, acting on behalf of and in the name of the groups from which they themselves derive their energy and purpose. Marx is almost false on almost every area of life. That men and women are interchangeable, false. That the family is an enemy construction of man when it's the basis of human dignity in all groups. That economic activity between human beings is always a form of oppression, when in actual fact almost everybody at one level or other gets something out of it, otherwise it couldn't subsist in the first place. That man is nicer than he is when human nature is dualist. Human beings are kind and nasty. They're avaricious, but they have a capacity for self-sacrifice. They're endlessly cowardly and lying, but they also have a penchant for courage and glory. That's what we are. The great religions actually always known what we are. They shift utopianism and the desire we could be different from what we are to another world. But the leftist pseudo-religions of modernity have brought it down to this level and tried to counter-propositionally achieve it through violence and political struggle. And the reason that it's got bloodier and bloodier until the end they become sickened of it themselves. The emergence within the Soviet bloc of neoliberals like Gorbachev, who realised the whole system was a fraud and it didn't work and they could hardly produce anything economically. And you went to the West and you went back home and people were struggling to get razor blades and bits of cheese and bits of soap and so on. And you thought to yourself, this is a superpower? We slaughtered tens of millions for this? And in a sense, I think the fact that he wouldn't defend the structure as it shuddered, because you can't reform a structure like that, it had to go down. And he sort of managed its descent, really, if you look retrospectively on what he did. He's hated in Russia now. Hated. Because he took away the security of ordinary people. And that generation particularly, their life expectancy went from about 76 to about 53. Because they lost everything. When capitalism couldn't come in, they hadn't even been educated to sort of write a check. It was terror for them. Because they'd never had to survive economically at an individual level. And that